Imagine being so desperate to provide for your family and then being offered the opportunity you've been waiting for from someone you know, someone you should be able to trust. Imagine embarking upon a journey to start this new chapter, only to have these moments be your last and to never ever see your loved ones again. In a small farming community, this was the reality for those who found themselves victim to a man who violated their trust. A man who stole so much more than just their lives. A man who to this day has never showed one inkling of remorse for the heinous crimes that he committed. This is the case of the serial offender, Johan Jacobus Williams. Welcome back to Murder and Mayhem, a Bella Monsoon exclusive production. I know you missed me, but I'm back and it hasn't been 3 months, okay? So the thing is, I've been working on something super top secret. It's a passion project for me and something that I am so excited over the next few weeks to show and share with this amazing community. But that's all I'm saying for now. I will be sharing more in the days to come, but until then, mum's the word. This week I'm back with a case that I'm sure many of you would have never even heard of. It barely made mainstream media. If you missed last week's episode, I did a deep dive into the tragic murder of Siam Lee, so I'll link it up above if you're interested. So for those who are new here, let me introduce myself. For those of you returning, you know the drill. Skip ahead using the timestamp on screen. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a registered mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with psychology, true crime, and understanding the motives that drive people to do what they do. My knowledge and experience within the field thus led me to create the first trauma-informed South African true crime series. This means that each episode is a new video that looks at a real-life crime from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of in an easy-to-understand format. So if all of that sounds like something that is right up your proverbial alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Bellaboo family. But if you're more a fan of podcasts and not so much of watching my face, that's okay. I will totally not hold it against you, and you can find me for my sister podcast, Murder and Mayhem, South African True Crime, available to stream on all major streaming channels. Yeah, all of them. Along with being able to find me on pretty much all social media channels, I post daily onto TikTok as well. I also have a special VIP club on Patreon full of the inner Bellaboo community. So if you want to find out what goes on over there, you can find it linked in the description of this video as well as on my profile. So just a quick disclaimer for today's episode. Today's episode contains material citing murder and assault. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victims mentioned nor their families. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the heinous crime that was committed while spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. As always, this episode has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes, where available, real-life accounts, video and images of and from individuals involved directly in the case. So without further delay, let's get into it. Today's narrative takes us to an area just under an hour's drive from Cape Town, an area focused on the production of wine and agricultural farming. Nestled in the heart of South Africa's Cape Winelands, the Wellington and Boland region is a study in contrast. On one hand, it dazzles with centuries-old French Huguenot heritage, rolling vineyards, award-winning wines, and quaint Cape Dutch homesteads that tell tales of a thriving agricultural and cultural legacy. On the other hand, beneath this picturesque surface lies a stark undercurrent of crime and social ills that have long troubled the community. Local residents report a surge in violent crimes, from brazen robberies, cable theft, and house break-ins to the chilling specter of serial murders and kidnappings. Sadly though, many of these stories never make it to mainstream media, and thus they remain unheard. Many in the area express frustration over what they describe as an ineffective police presence. A presence, or lack thereof, which leaves vulnerable citizens to fend for themselves amid rising gang violence, drug-related offenses, and even gender-based violence. months. Economic disparities and social unrest further fuel these challenges. So today I'm attempting to peel back the idyllic facade, to explore how beauty and brutality converge in a region where history, culture, and the stark realities of crime created an ill-fated narrative. In order to understand the beginning, though, we need to skip to the end. You'll soon understand why. The year was 2016. A young woman, along with her infant son, were on the way to Worcester from Cape Town to visit her family. But unfortunately, due to her error, she landed up on the wrong train and ended up in Wellington. Given the fact that Wellington is quite a small town and the trains don't run too often, she was essentially stranded for the evening. Without the funds to do much and not knowing anyone in the area, she was terrified, to say the least. And that's when fate would bring a man, a security guard at the train station, into her life. At the time, she would believe that it was divine intervention, but it would only be later known that that meeting would change the trajectory of so many lives. Forever. So it was Easter weekend at the time, which is why she was going to visit family. But this man had not hesitated to look after herself and her son for the evening. He was much older than her, over double her age, but something about him made her feel at ease. She would call him uncle from that day on, as a sign of respect. Anyways, so that evening he had bought the two of them, herself and her son, dinner, and he had made sure that they were safe whilst they waited at the train station. The next morning, he would make sure that the two were going to make it to Worcester, just under an hour away, by putting them in a taxi. In South Africa, when one says taxi, they are more than likely referring to a very specific type of public transport. But if you're not from here, it's probably not the one you're thinking of. I'm referring to a combi that is affordable and used by many. It may not necessarily ever be the safest option due to some vehicles' lack of maintenance and questionable drivers, but it does remain one of the most utilized forms of transport in the country. As of stats from a few years ago, there was over 250,000 minibus taxis operating in South Africa, with almost a third of them being operated illegally, i.e. without operating licenses, or in many cases driving licenses. But regardless, they form the backbone of the community, servicing over 15 million commuters daily. But I digress. A short while later, the woman arrived safe and sound to her family, who were evidently overjoyed. As a thank you gesture, later that year, during Christmas time, her family would invite his family, himself, his wife, and their 3 children, over to the home for a Christmas lunch. Her family even bought his children gifts and gave him money to travel back to Wellington. They appreciated his kind gesture so much, and over the next few months, they would get to know him quite well. Fast forward to June of 2018, about a year and a bit later, when this man had told this woman's family that he had found her a job. She was 21 years old at the time, and the job was as a wine packer on a farm in Wellington. As work is difficult to often find, she was overjoyed. The only caveat was that she had to come that very day, as his wife had arranged the position and it was a night shift position. Feeling extremely grateful for the opportunity, she decided to make the trip, not really thinking twice about this man's motives. Because from the very first time he had met her, he had only shown her kindness, and herself and her family had no reason to doubt his intentions. At 1 p.m. on the 23rd of June, she made her way to the Belleville train station from her Kuilsrivier home. The next train to Wellington was only at 3 p.m. At 4:20 p.m., she had messaged her mom to let her know that she was safe and she had met this man at the train station. An hour later, she updated her mom yet again that the pair had walked for a while, but they had finally arrived at his place. She had described the location as a klein hokkie, a Wendy house, with a double bed and a couch. After she had dinner, she texted her mom again, this time to let her know that she had eaten, but she was feeling sleepy. Her mom had then questioned where this man's wife was, as, it was her who had arranged the position and she was supposed to take her to work the night shift that very evening. Remember, that's why there was all the urgency. First, obvious red flag. The man had then told her mother that his wife was in Citrusdal, which was about an hour and a half away, because her mother had had a heart attack. But no one should worry because she will be back in time to work the night shift. In the next few moments, though, he messaged this woman again, saying that now his wife had arranged for her daughter, the woman who was messaging, and herself, his wife, to work the day shift. Still trusting him because, up until this point, he had not really given herself or her family a reason not to. Her mother was slightly at ease as the communication was consistent. The next morning, she spoke to her daughter again, but this time from the man's phone because her daughter's battery was apparently dead. They spoke via text, and in the message, she stated that she had started working that morning. After around 9 a.m., her daughter sent her another message, which she found odd, as she used big Afrikaans words that she normally didn't use, like behulpsaam, basically meaning helpful. Her daughter's grammar was also incorrect and off, which was very uncharacteristic of her. That evening, her daughter messaged her again. The message read, and I quote and translate: Ek weet nie hoekom ek nou so baie na julle verlang. Lief vir ma, my kind en stiefpa. I don't know why I miss you so much right now. Love you, mom, my child and stepdad. Now, this message sat completely wrong with her mother because not only did she never call her mother Ma, but she always called her son by his first name, Dawson, because she had always felt so strongly that he must have his own identity. Additionally, there were all those errors in grammar that her daughter would just never make. That Monday and Tuesday, she insisted on speaking to her daughter on the phone, but with no luck. On Wednesday, she had enough, and so she got into her car and drove to Wellington. On the way there, she was speaking to this man, but she didn't let him know that she was coming. During their conversation, he had told her that he was on his way to George, a few hours' drive away. At his home, she had someone else knock on his door, and what do you know? Lo and behold, the man himself had answered. Not expecting to come face to face with this woman's mother, he had quickly directed herself and her husband to the farm next door where he told her that her daughter was working. As soon as they had left him, little did they know that he had left his home too. When they arrived on the bordering farm, not only did they realize and find out that there was no activity on there like wine packing, but the people working on that farm didn't even know who her daughter was. Truly terrified at this point, her mother had immediately approached the police station. There she was informed that this man's wife had actually taken out an interdict against him and she had left him 2 weeks prior. The police then sent officers to his home, only to find out that he had absconded. And so the search began for the woman who would later be known as Chantal Matheson. Chantal's mother Carol and her husband would remain camped outside of the Wellington police station from June 27th to July 2nd. Why, you may ask? Well, because she was determined to find her child, and she knew that if she made enough of a scene, that someone would have to listen. After questioning residents in the immediate area, they soon discovered that individuals had seen Chantal, but they didn't know where she had gone. At the police station, they were able to obtain an interdict to track this man's phone. When searching his Wendy house and the surrounding area, one of the investigating officers would later find Chantal's belongings, which included a necklace with her name on it. Upon seeing that in the evidence bag, Carol knew to expect the worst, because her daughter never had taken that necklace off. Not since the day she was given it. This man was on the run for 5 days until he was arrested. He did not turn himself in, no. He was only caught after the police received a tip-off. He was found on a farm named Ongegund, an archaic Afrikaans term meaning begrudged. Pretty apt for the manner in which he was arrested on the 2nd of July 2018. Whilst he was being held in custody, Carol begged him to tell her where her daughter was. He, however, had requested for his daughter to be brought to the police station, saying that he would then only reveal Chantal's location. Being in control and toying with the emotions of his victims and their families was something that would resurface again and again in the months to follow. Upon being allowed to see his child, he had then indicated to Carol where she could find hers, namely in a shallow grave on Abenrau farm. Chantal had been strangled with a black and white sock. There were 2 buttons on the sock in which he had placed 2 sticks so that he could wrap the socks around her neck more tightly. She was also found face down on the ground. On the 3rd of July, Chantal's body was positively identified by her heartbroken mother. The next day, the man appeared in the Wellington Magistrates Court on a charge of murder. The man, who would later go on to be known by multiple monikers, would go by the real name of Johan Jacobus Williams. Whilst he was in custody, on the 7th of July, Chantal's funeral would be held at the Korkfontein Primary School Hall. During her service, she was spoken of as a hero. Attendees would state that if it wasn't for her death, Johan would never have been caught, and his other victims would never have been known. Yes, you did hear me correctly. I did say other victims. The pastor's sermon had read, and I quote, "Chantal is our hero. There are other people who have been waiting for 6 years. Now it is through Chantal's death that the others have been found." End quote. I mean, I do get it, but it's heartbreaking that her son, who was only 3 years old at the time, now has to grow up without his mother, all because of one man's selfish actions. During the service, the pastor implored others to get rid of their hatred and bad feelings and essentially be the bigger person. So basically the opposite of what I just said prior, I guess. Right, so remember I just mentioned, or rather the pastor mentioned, the other victims? Well, the discovery of Chantal's body would unearth both literally and figuratively a dark and disturbing series of crimes spanning years back. The next body to be discovered was a woman who had gone missing just 1 week before Chantal. This is what had happened. On June 16th of 2018, 33-year-old Maria Isaacs from Malmesbury, desperate for employment, was overjoyed when a man had offered her a steady job. The man wasn't a stranger though, he was apparently known as a friend to her. She was so excited at the prospect of being able to contribute to her household again, a household where her mother was the breadwinner. Maria was thus set to meet the man at the Wellington police station, because I mean, that was the safe option, right? That's what you're told to do when meeting individuals you're not familiar with. I mean, if you're selling something on Facebook Marketplace, etc., etc. She needed a lift to the station though, and so she had asked her cousin, Magdalene. On the day, her cousin had dropped her off and sat with her for a while whilst they waited for the man, her friend, to arrive. Her cousin was not familiar with this individual. So whilst waiting, this man had called Maria, and he had sounded almost rude as he insinuated that he had been waiting for her, even though the pair had arrived on time and they were waiting for him to arrive. But anyways, so he arrived, approached the pair, and Maria had introduced him as Johan, the man who had organized her the job opportunity. Yes, the very same Johan Williams. Her cousin had still said to him that if anything happens to Maria, that he would have to deal with her. He responded in Afrikaans, which I have translated and will quote, "I will drive over your bakkie with my big truck." End quote. For those who are not aware, a bakkie is like a pickup truck. Her cousin had assumed this was a joke and had thus laughed. In hindsight, it was the ominous foretelling of the entitled actions of one man. The pair, Johan and Maria, had then left on foot, as they apparently needed to buy some stuff from Spar, a local grocery store. This was the last time that Magdalene would see her cousin. Hours later, she had phoned her, but Johan had answered, stating that Maria was in the shower. She had called back again, this time just after 10 p.m., but then there was no answer. And this would be repeated multiple times over the next week that followed. Maria would either not answer, or Johan would answer and state that she was busy. However, she was not too busy to send multiple messages to her family requesting money. Money which her family had sent her a few times. At the later trial, her cousin would identify her clothing items as well as a Tempo watch that she had received as a farewell gift from her previous job. All of these items were found in and around Johan's premises. And so, after Maria had seemingly disappeared off the face of the earth, a month later a call would arrive saying that a spot had been pointed out by Johan. On July 2nd, her body was discovered in another shallow grave. The cause of her death was determined to be strangulation with severe head trauma. There was a shoelace around her neck with a stick once again in it. So now we're up to 2 bodies, but unfortunately, it doesn't end there. On the 26th of July 2012, yes, 6 years prior to the discovery, Johan had accompanied a 35-year-old woman to obtain a loan. This woman just so happened to be the mother of the girl that he was interested in at the time. And yes, you did hear that sentence correctly. You see, Johan had not only liked, but had also entered into a relationship with this woman's daughter, a girl who was young enough to honestly be his daughter. And as you can imagine, this woman, her mother, was not having it. She had thus sent her daughter to Cape Town in a bid to get her as far away from Johan as possible. Despite the issues between herself and Johan though, like many others in the area, she relied on him for transport to the town. And so the two remained in contact. And one day after finding out that she had run into debt, Johan had been so kind as to arrange a way for her to get herself out of the situation by securing her a new job. A job where she was allegedly going to be earning 15,000 Rand a month, which was a small fortune for someone who was used to working on farms, where the average salary was often 100 Rand or less than that per day. She spoke about having a bad feeling about it, but her situation was desperate, and so she had arranged a lift to go to Checkers where she was meeting him. It was the 16th of July 2012. Johan had appeared and told the woman, as well as the individual who had dropped her, that he would have her back by 6 p.m. The individual thus decided to wait at Checkers for this woman. 6 p.m. came and went, and they had phoned Johan to find out what was going on. During that call, he had said that the woman would only be home later. By 8 p.m., the woman's husband was worried and he called her. She had answered and she told him that she was on her way home. She told him to take some food out of the fridge and heat it until she would be home to cook for them. And those were the last words that her husband would ever hear from her. An hour and a bit later, he called again, and this time Johan said something odd. He had told her husband, Ruben, that the police wouldn't help him if he reported her missing because she had not been missing for long enough. What an odd thing to say. The night came and went, and with still no sign of the woman, the next morning the search began. Natalie Jonkers was officially reported missing at the police station. Her family in the meantime had traced Johan, of course, and demanded to know where Natalie was. He told them on multiple occasions that he would provide them with the information, but he never did. He then later stated that whilst she was waiting for a lift, he had heard Natalie scream, turned around and saw a car racing away, tires screeching. 2 days later, he had come to her home, and when he had left, the family would soon realize that some of her clothing was missing. Natalie's daughter, you know, the one he was obsessed with, would also return to the small town to come and help look for her mother. In the later trial, she would also testify as to how Johan led herself and her family on a wild goose chase, even taking her to meet a Malawian man who discussed diamond deals, but never took them to Natalie. Johan would be brought in for questioning, but soon released, and after that, he would disappear from Ongeland for 6 years until 2018. Sound familiar? It would also only be 6 years later, through the discovery of Chantal's body, that the remains of Natalie would be found. Due to the extreme level of decomposition, the cause of death could not be established. A scarf was, however, found around her neck, knotted 3 times. The family, once the body was identified, did not even have the money to bury her, and thus they had asked the police to do it for them. The police had stated that they would tell them the location where she was buried, but they never did. So to this day, her mother has no idea where her daughter's remains are. As if the entire family has not been through enough as it is. And one would thus imagine that Johan's reign of terror had ended there. Well, no, not actually. Before he was arrested, he would terrorize one last victim, the mother of one of his children and his most recent ex-partner. During the later trial, this witness would take to the stand, keeping her identity anonymous, but speaking of the trauma she had endured at the hands of Johan. I'll explain in detail in a minute. At his initial court appearances in 2018, Johan had even considered applying for bail, according to his lawyers at the time. The community were not having it though, and had stated that if he was released, they were going to show him exactly what they were going to do to him. He wasn't bothered in the least though, and he had showed the crowd that had gathered his middle finger as he shouted, and I quote, "You all mother..." End quote. During this time, he would also speak to the public, a local newspaper actually, Die Son, with a wild story. He would state that he was forced to commit the murders. In particular, Natalie Jonker's one, her daughter, his partner, apparently told him to kill her mother to prove his love for her. He stated that his life was in danger and people on the outside had even threatened to come to the prison to kill him. For each murder, he had apparently demanded between 5,000 and 15,000, as well as cigarettes and KFC. This entire theory was quite quickly debunked after his partner's phone was searched and she was ruled out as a suspect. So, as is common with the judicial system in South Africa, month after month, the case was postponed as the trial was delayed. Multiple times, mind you. And in the meanwhile, besides that odd narrative to the media, he was pretty silent about his motives. In December of 2019, Johan would appear in court, where the extent of his reign of terror would finally be heard. He would also plead not guilty to all the charges set before him. And then, of course, there would be more delays, a global pandemic, and of course, the South African judicial system. In February of 2022, Johan would finally appear again in court, where he was set to sign a plea deal. This would mean that everything would be concluded. But once again, court proceedings were postponed after he had decided at the last minute that he was not happy with the terms of the plea deal. The conclusion was thus reached that a trial would then need to take place. And with the trial, of course, came a lot more admin and, you guessed it, many more postponements. Court was then set to apparently resume on the 11th of April. It would, however, only be the following year, no surprise there, that court would resume. And so the trial finally began on October 9th of 2023. Johan was all smiles as he appeared in the dock. During the trial, his behavior was incredibly disturbing, with him executing what would later be described by the judge as willful defiance. Besides continuously maintaining his innocence, he looked particularly smug during proceedings and was intent on tormenting the victims' families and his ex-girlfriend when she took the stand to testify against him. Remember I mentioned her a little while earlier? She was one of multiple witnesses, a family member and relative of Natalie Jonker's, as well as the mother of one of his children. Yes, he had multiple children with multiple women. But that's part of his later narrative, which I'll get into soon enough. She later requested to keep her identity private, and thus her name was withheld from the public. Her testimony would state that between 2010 and 2018, the pair had dated, with their child being born in 2014. Keep in mind, she was far younger than him at the time. The woman would later state that their relationship had grown and developed over time as their friendship grew, but highlighted the fact that it was void of love. Add this to the fact that Johan had also terrorized herself and her family, as her family were not accepting of the relationship. It had become so severe that on one occasion he had set the homes of her mother, grandmother, and neighbor alight, just as an attempt to see her, his former lover. Johan had also threatened her mother that if she did not give her, the witness, to him, he would hammer a nail into her head and she would be a tonzella, which means a type of zombie in witchcraft. I mean, I haven't heard of that before, but it's sounding a lot like the Tokolosh, which also has a nail in its head. I don't know. On top of being his partner for a long period of time, she would also be a victim to him, as well as the only victim known to have escaped him. You see, a few weeks before Maria's murder, she had been living with him, and she had made the decision to leave. She was tired of the copious amounts of abuse she had experienced at the hands of Johan. She had thus applied to the court for an interdict and protection order against him. She was done with their relationship, which for the longest of times had been devoid of love, affection, and authenticity. And she was moving on. She was speaking to someone else, someone who was far different, the complete opposite, if you will, of Johan. This new man was kind, understanding, and caring, and he wanted to help her. But Johan was not going to let her go that easily. Someone had tipped him off that she was getting a protection order against him. And so on the day she was set to appear in court, he found her. Remember, she had left the home with the children the days prior. During the later trial, her current husband, remember that man that I said showed real affection for her? Yeah. Well, he would take to the stand. His name was obviously also withheld for the duration of proceedings. He would share some disturbing tidbits of conversations that he had personally had with Johan. He would state how his relationship with Johan's ex-girlfriend had begun in 2018 after they had been introduced by a mutual friend. The two had began chatting and she had confided in him about her current situation with Johan. This new man had thus offered her support and assistance within the situation. This had led to her eventually wanting to obtain an interdict against Johan, which I just mentioned, in an attempt to not only flee that relationship, but to also start a new life. And it seemed to be going to plan, except for the fact that Johan pitched up on the day of the interdict hearing. The new man in her life received a voice note warning him that Johan was aware of what was going on, so the woman should be careful. He had thus been consistently speaking to her via text message when all of a sudden she had stopped responding. This was not only odd, but also extremely worrying given the situation. Over the next days, he had intermittent contact with her, which was at times intercepted by Johan, who had told him to forget about her, stating that this new man would never see the woman and her children again. Johan would even go as far as to describe to this man the sexual acts he had performed with this woman against her will. This was the kind of man that Johan was and is. And speaking of those types of acts, well, she would be a victim of heinous abuse at his hands. He assaulted her multiple times in front of her children, as well as physically harming her. Her last interaction with him, just days before his arrest, she would overhear a phone call that he had with an unknown person. This individual had been making inquiries about the location of a person named Chantal. But Chantal wasn't the only victim that she had inadvertently heard of. It was also heard that at an earlier point in time, Maria and Johan had exchanged text messages prior to Maria's murder. This same witness would state how she overheard the pair talking on the phone about a car that Johan was supposed to buy on her behalf. Later, she would also read messages on his phone from Maria, stating that she was going to the police station if Johan did not give her money back or bring the car back. As I mentioned, Johan was apprehended on a local farm, Onchachand farm, and it was days later that the third skeleton would be unearthed. Further forensic examinations and tests would finally confirm that this was indeed the body of Natalie Jonkers. Appearing too on the witness stand during the trial was Chantal's mother, the woman whose fierce love for her daughter changed so many lives and brought so much closure. Chantal's mother, Carol, would describe how difficult it was to board the train to the court, as she knew that it was her daughter's last used mode of transport before her murder. She did, however, still take to the stand to read a victim impact statement. She would also state how the way that Johan had behaved during the trial added insult to injury for the families and the victims. Carol would say, and I quote, "Her loss hurts. What hurts me even more is that her son, who she cherished, has to grow up without a mother. She may have been a young mother, but she was a great mother. And now she is missing all the big moments in his life. He did not just kill my child. He killed a household. He killed a family. He killed a friend. He killed a community." End quote. Even though it was planned, Johan would make the last-minute decision to not take to the stand and testify in his defense. This meant that there would be no answers given to his victims as well as the family members of his victims. Some had even rushed from Malmesbury, about an hour away, which was not the quickest, easiest, or cheapest trip for them, only to find this information out at the last minute. Some were disappointed, and others, like Carol, just felt pure anger. Johan, however, was unbothered, cleaning his glasses whilst the legal counsels discussed the matter at hand. As the trial progressed, the forensic evidence would detail how 2 of the 3 bodies showcased that the victims had been before being strangled to death. Unfortunately, in the case of Natalie, her body was too decomposed, basically down to a skeleton, to determine the cause of death. Remember, it had been 6 years. Forensic pathologist Dr. Denise Lawrence would state that the women were found tied up. Each one either had a sock, a scarf, or shoelaces tied around their necks in a double or triple knot. She would go on to testify that sticks were kept in the knot so that the person, in this case Johan, could easily tighten them. Ligature marks were also found around the necks of the victims, which were an indication of the cause of death. Strangulation. 3 other state witnesses would also testify next. Gertwin Goodman, Sheil Goodman, and Gertwin's mother Betty would take to the stand. 2 weeks before Chantal arrived, the witnesses would recall seeing Johan with Maria on June 16th. He had introduced her to them as a cousin that he was arranging a job for. Betty had met her that one time, but never saw her again, as Johan had stated that her family in Wellington had picked her up. A short while later, Gertwin's wife was given a tempo watch by Johan as a thank you gift for helping him through tough times. It would later turn out that that watch belonged to Maria. And a short while later, before they even knew it, Gertwin would state how he had seen Chantal arrive with her tog bag. Johan had been pulling her red trolley suitcase. He was not introduced to her though, as the pair had proceeded straight to the Wendy house and he never ever saw her again. Days later, however, Johan had approached him with a BlackBerry phone that he wanted to sell. On the phone, Gertwin had seen that the screensaver was a picture of the girl he had seen with the red suitcase, Chantal. The next day, he had also witnessed Johan trying to throw a necklace with the name Chantal on it onto the roof of one of the neighbors' homes, stating that he needed to get rid of it before his girlfriend arrived home. Remember that necklace? Yeah, the very same one that Chantal never took off. As state witness testimony came to an end, and with Johan not testifying, his legal team also made the decision to not call any witnesses of their own. I'm assuming because there weren't really any, you know? But hey, maybe that's not the reason. Maybe there were other valid reasons. After years, literally years of waiting, in February of 2024, Johan Jacobus Williams was finally found guilty. He was convicted on 19 counts. These included 6 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 2 counts of attempted rape, 3 counts of murder, 1 count of housebreaking with intent to commit arson, 1 count of arson, 1 count of assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, due to the state of decomposition in Natalie's body, there was no DNA evidence to link to the rape and sexual assault charge, so that had to be dropped. During the verdict hearing, the judge stated that due to the fact that Johan had pointed out the burial sites of the 3 confirmed victims, it proved beyond reasonable doubt that he was guilty. In her judgment, Judge Rosheni Ali highlighted the killing pattern that seemed to emerge when Williams perpetrated the horrendous crimes. Maria Isaac's brother had said, and I quote, "No matter what sentence he receives by the court, it'll not bring back our loved ones. I feel he should get 1 life term for every victim he murdered. Only then will we try and get some peace." End quote. After the verdict was heard, Johan had apparently fired his legal representation. This meant that the sentencing was postponed, as Legal Aid SA had rejected his application for new representation. Yeah, so more delays. And so it would be another 7 months until the victims and their families could finally put the saga to rest and receive the closure that they so desperately needed. And not only needed, that they deserved. In September of 2024, after more postponements, the 7-year wait for justice for some victims finally came to an end, as the sentencing was held. Judge Rosheni Ali's would go on to describe the 52-year-old man as having a flagrant disregard for the law, authority of the courts, as well as being someone who had used his victims as objects. Serial perpetrator Johan Jacobus Williams was sentenced to 3 life terms for 3 counts of murder, 5 life terms for 5 counts of rape, 24 years for 6 counts of kidnapping, 8 years for assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, 6 years for arson, and 6 years for housebreaking. The overall sentence was 260 years, although all the life sentences will run concurrently. So in actuality, he will only serve 25 years in prison. Yeah. The judge would state how cruel Johan's actions were, particularly toward Chantal's mother, whom he had led to believe that she was still alive, when the truth, well, it was far from it. His tormenting of his victims was categorically disturbing and left lasting impressions.
The accused planned the commission of the offences. He treated the victims with violence and indignity, and he is a threat to society.
Life after sentencing finally resumed, in some way at least, for the victims and the families of the victims that Johan had left such a traumatic impact on. In 2020, Ruben, who never recovered from his wife's passing, would too move on to another realm. He had said that the Lord could take him because his wife was no longer there anymore. They had been what others had deemed the perfect couple. He would peel vegetables or spice the meat whilst she was in the kitchen cooking, and they did everything together. Her loss left him with a hollow space that would never ever be filled. And someone who would know all about that feeling was Chantal's mother, who would later say, and I quote, "I cannot believe this is someone who we had bride with. Someone who was at my house. I don't smile. I lost trust in any and everyone. The free-spirited person I was is gone. I have built walls around me. I am broken in pieces, and it's not just us as a household, but Chantal's friends, our community. He broke and stole so much from everyone." End quote. Chantal's son is now growing up without his mother, having been only 3 years old when she was stolen from him. Chantal was only 17 when she had given birth, but she sacrificed everything to make sure that he would have all the attention and the best life that she could give him. As he has grown up, he is an avid rugby player, and Carol knows that Chantal would have been so proud of the man that he's becoming. A man so unlike the one that had stolen his mother from him. So, who exactly was Johan Jacobus Williams? Well, besides being labeled the Boerland and Wellington serial killer by various media outlets, he was and is the father of 9 children from multiple women. As in many cases, childhood history and information, especially when a psychological evaluation has not taken place, is virtually impossible to find. What we do know, though, is that back in 2012, he was working as a driver. He was well known to farm workers in the area, and he used his place in the community to lure his victims under the false pretense of much-needed work. Once he met with them and had them where he wanted them, he would take their lives via strangulation and then bury their bodies in shallow graves around the farm. This was his modus operandi for all 3 known victims. So whilst we may not know very much about him, the method of murder can tell us a lot about the perpetrator. Let me explain. Male serial killers who use the act of strangulation to kill female victims often do it because the action is so intimate. It allows them to exert complete physical and psychological control over their victims. Unlike methods that rely on impersonal weapons, manual strangulation forces the offender to engage directly with the victim's body, enabling them to savor every moment of domination. This up-close encounter often fuels a perverse sexual arousal, as the killer derives satisfaction not only from the power to take a life, but also the slow, deliberate process of cutting off the victim's air supply. These actions can be thus torturous as well as erotically charged. As was noted, and as I previously mentioned, with 2 of his victims, there were indications that taken place. The psychological roots behind these behaviors are complex. Many experts point to early experiences of abuse, neglect, or humiliation that can instill deep-seated feelings of anger and inadequacy. For some, the act of strangulation becomes a symbolic retribution, a way to reclaim power and control that they never experienced in their formative years. This method allows the killer to enact a twisted form of intimacy, blurring the lines between aggression and sexual gratification. The slow pace of strangulation offers ample opportunity for the killer to relive and intensify these traumatic emotions, making it an almost ritualistic act that satisfies a desperate need for dominance. In essence, the use of strangulation intertwines psychological, symbolic, pragmatic factors. It's an act that encapsulates the killer's need for intimate and mediated control, whilst simultaneously serving as a method that plays into their deep-rooted traumatic experiences and sexual fantasies. This disturbing blend of personal vengeance and arousal not only defines the modus operandi of these killers, but also continues to captivate the attention of forensic psychologists and criminal profilers who seek to understand the dark recesses of the human mind. And hopefully, with the more we can understand, the less lives have to be lost. You see, the thing is, Johan was able to get away with this for so long because the lives of lower income individuals from remote areas are just not valued as highly as others. Some may feel that me saying that is a controversial statement to make, but in my opinion at least, it's simply the truth. It took the murder of yet another innocent woman and the persistence of her mother to find her to unearth both literally and figuratively the horrific actions of Johan. As grateful as they were for the closure, Natalie Jonker's mother had said, and I quote, "If the police took Natalie's disappearance seriously in 2012, Chantal and Maria's lives, others could have been spared." End quote. The legacy of apartheid in South Africa created a deeply segregated society where economic and racial divisions remain stark. Poor, predominantly non-white communities continue to face systemic neglect, under-resourced police services, limited healthcare, and minimal media coverage, all contributing to a reality where crimes in these areas are often under-investigated with their victims overlooked. For instance, whilst affluent neighborhoods enjoy swift and thorough responses to criminal incidents via multiple private services, many incidents in impoverished townships languish without the same level of attention or justice. This unequal treatment is not a matter of just individual prejudice alone. It reflects decades of institutionalized bias. Bias that signals through policies and resource allocations that the lives of the poor are just seen as less valuable. And that's the harsh reality. The lesson that many take away from this is that poor lives just don't matter. And it's high time that we change that narrative. All lives are valuable and every story counts. Thank you for listening to Natalie's. Thank you for listening to Maria's. Thank you for listening to Chantal's. Until the next one, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I know each and every single one of you are. Bye!